On the Radar with the CBS 17 Storm Team.
Welcome back to On the Radar. This week we have some fun topics. We talked about winter weather and what to expect as you go through this upcoming season. And if you've been out and about as of late, probably feels like some winter weather is on the way, or maybe you just don't like the cold rain. I don't know. I'm meteorologist Ross Whitley. We have meteorologist Rachel Dunsing here as well. So it is your favorite duo, Ross and Rachel,
Is
back
it your
at it once
favorite
again.
duo?
I don't know.
To be determined.
You saw the package I left for you guys last week,
was
which
great.
was, hey, even when you think you're rid of me, you still have to deal with me.
Right.
Just can't get rid of Ross. So
Right.
We have some fun topics to talk about this week.
Yeah, we do. So like we mentioned, talking a little bit more about winter, why it feels more like winter. Something you've probably heard of called the wedge. What is it? We're going to explain a little bit more. We're also going to have Wes check in with what we experienced in November. And then it's a big winter heavy show. We have a lot to talk about in terms of that.
Yeah, and maybe your least favorite subject if you're a North Carolinian or you've spent any time here over several winters. And then, of course, is ice storms. They don't happen all that frequently, at least not the damaging type of ice storms. But when they happen, they are significant and probably one of our most significant types of winter weather. Because let's face it, we don't see 20-inch snowfalls all that often.
Not often.
So
Probably every 20 years?
Yeah, probably about the same occurrence of ice storms as well. At least devastating ice storms, probably about once every 20 years. So let's just jump into it because we both know that we're both long-winded. And if we don't, we are going to go way over on our time.
And we'll get in trouble again.
And
anyway.
Anyways, so far this fall, we have had an active storm pattern, which we desperately needed because we have been very, very dry. Early in the fall, we just didn't have a whole lot of rain. Really late summer, which isn't all that unusual. Typically, we go through a drier period coming out of summer and going into fall. If we don't have severe weather or, God forbid, any kind of tropical weather around late in fall, that's typically how we get our moisture. So if we don't have that, we have to rely on an active storm pattern. And sometimes that can be hard to find. So far this fall, we have had, thankfully, some active activity. And unfortunately, that has also been coupled with some pretty decent cold fronts. So it's been quite chilly as well.
Yeah, and a big part of that, obviously, too, we're kind of looking at the jet stream pattern. And I know we're going to kind of allude to this a little bit later on, but there are actually kind of two jet streams that we pay attention to. And because we are far enough south in the United States, we can deal with the southernmost jet stream, otherwise known as the subtropical jet. But the other one that is typically sort of kept to the north, the polar jet stream, even though we are relatively far south on the continent and the country, that polar jet can also dip far enough south. So we have this interaction with a really, really cold air mass and a slightly less cold air mass as we get these two jet streams sort of interacting. One tends to bring a little more moisture and one tends to bring really, really cold air. What happens when they interact with each other right on top of us?
That's our big storms.
That's our big storms.
Yeah,
whether it's severe weather or a snowstorm or an ice storm, when those two interact right on top of us, it gets a little crazy.
Yeah, that's Superstorm of 93 for all you weather fans out there. Polar jet collapsed in March, came all the way down, subtropical jet combined. We call that phasing. And then that created just one heck of a storm system that worked up the East Coast. So far this fall, we haven't really seen that. These two have kind of been out of sync. So the storm's either been off to our north and we've kind of gotten a warm up and then a cool down on the backside of that, or we've had the storm to the south, but we're already in that warmer phase. So we're waiting on that cold front to come on through. So those two not syncing up is really why we haven't seen any kind of explosive weather. We've just seen some necessary rain that we've needed over the last couple of weeks. So that is some good news for us, and we certainly will enjoy that. But as we get into December, we are talking of the transition from fall, late fall, into winter. And what does that mean? Well, you hear the term winter solstice all the time, and most people have no idea what winter solstice means. So Rachel, break it down for us.
Yeah, so the winter solstice is kind of the official start of the winter season, but it's astronomical winter. So technically there's a tale of two winters, if you will. Sounds like an old Charles Dickens novel. I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe we could make a parody. So you have meteorological or climatological winter, which starts December 1st, and basically because it's always the same amount of dates, so it's better for statistics and numbers and things like that. But astronomical winter, which is what the winter solstice is when winter begins based on when the sun crosses over the Tropic of Capricorn. And you can kind of see it with the graphic there. So once the sun crosses over that Tropic of Capricorn, I forget what the technical word, isn't there a technical word for it?
I think so, but I can't remember.
It is escaping me in this moment. I
Yeah.
apologize to
We
everyone.
should have written that down.
We should have. We should have. But basically, the moment the sun crosses that area, that's when we officially have winter in the northern hemisphere. Now, it is typically our shortest day of the year. This year, we have about 9 hours, 43 minutes of daylight. So obviously, shortest day of the year is in terms of daylight, not
Right.
actual time. I feel like we know that, but someone's going to make a comment either way. But the North Pole basically is tilted farthest away from the sun at this point. But again, this is winter in the northern hemisphere, and the southern hemisphere, that is when they get to experience summer. Winter for us, but of course, equal and opposite reaction for everything.
Yeah, and fun fact, we are actually closer as far as distance from the sun. We are closer in winter than we are in summer for
Correct.
the northern hemisphere. So if you thought that the distance from the sun, how we're orbiting around the sun, had any impact on the seasons, it does not. It is
Yeah.
all based on that tilt.
Yep.
And the Earth is tilted at 23.5 degrees,
That's
which is why Tropic of Cancer is 23.5 degrees north, and Tropic of Capricorn is 23.5 degrees south. So
Yep.
that is where the sun goes between, and you always have equidistant solar radiation to the equator, which is in the center of the Earth. So they're always getting the same amount of radiation no matter what side the sun is, even as the sun works right over the equinox, which is when the sun is directly over the equator. So all the words making sense now. Just fancy terms for when we change the seasons and the tilt of the Earth. But that is astronomical winter, which
Yep.
we are getting closer and closer to. Of course, meteorological winter, as you alluded to, is here.
Yeah.
December 1st. That is our coldest months, December, January, and February. And then meteorological spring starts in March. So, hey, it's coming. We're getting closer to
We're
that.
one
as
day
well.
closer now to spring.
One day closer to spring. But we saw quite an interesting November. And of course, we have Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein to talk exactly about what happened in November.
And just like that, 11 months of the year are in the books. And here comes the final month of the year. Let's look back on the wild weather we had in November 2025. Of the 30 days, 20 of them were at or above average, and 10 of them were below average. We had some pretty wild swings, and the month wrapped up with the average high being 58 degrees. Speaking of wild swings, our warmest day in November was 77 on the 9th, and our coldest morning of the month was the second to last morning. That was 21 degrees. Here's what sticks out to me. We only had about an inch of rain. That is the least amount of rain we've had in any month for the whole year. But it was exciting in the precipitation department because we actually had a trace of snow on November 11th. We don't always get snow in November around here. As for where we are for the whole year, if you factor in just the first 11 months of the year using average temperatures, so highs and lows, look where 2025 is. We are right now living through the fourth warmest year on record. These records for the triangle go all the way back to 1887, so we got a lot of years here. These average temperatures, again, are highs and lows. That's why they are where they are. And the reason we're number 4 is because, remember, April, June, and July were all the hottest months on record. Things turned crazy in August and beyond with much cooler temperatures, but it was hot enough early on where we are still just barely maintaining the fourth hottest year on record. So what is a typical December look like here in central North Carolina? Well, our average highs go from 58 to 52, so still cooling throughout the month. Our average lows go from 37 to 32. The winter solstice is December 21st. Of course, the Earth's journey around the sun, our planet is tilting different directions. Well, now on December 21st, we will be tilting farthest away from the sun in the northern hemisphere. That's why we have winter and cooler temperatures. And our days are still getting shorter. They start to get longer on December 22nd. Slowly but surely, but they will start to get longer. And December is also the third snowiest month of the year for central North Carolina. We get 15% of our snow in December. And here is that breakdown. I think we all know that January is our snowiest month. When you take the 30-year average for the triangle, half our snow comes in January. February is second, and like I said, December is the third snowiest month with 15% of the snow happening then. I want to get back to the daylight thing too, because something interesting is happening here this first part of December. These are all the sunrise and sunset times for the entire month of December, minus the 31st. But happening this first full week of December, our sun is setting at 5:01 p.m. It does it for many days in a row, the first 11 days actually, and that is the earliest sunset we have all year long. You can see on the 12th and beyond, it happens slowly, but our sunsets start to get later and later. Now, on the flip side, our latest sunrise doesn't happen. You can see the numbers still keep getting later and later as we go throughout December. The latest sunrise doesn't happen until January. And more on the sun, you know, shorter days means the sun is up above the horizon longer. Well, December is also the month where our noon sun angle is at its lowest that it is throughout the whole year. The opposite of that would be June. When it's at its highest angle, we have the most direct sunlight. That's one of the reasons why our skin burns a little easier from being outside, is because we have more direct sunlight for longer times. So what about the outlook for this December? We talked about averages and typical. Well, the temperature outlook for this December has a good portion of North Carolina, not all of it. You can see the southeast, warmer than average temperatures are expected, and wetter than average conditions for a good portion of the East Coast. And one final note, now that we're in December, we talked about the winter solstice. And that's what we traditionally know as astronomical winter. We grew up knowing the first day of winter is later in December. But when you consider the science community, meteorological winter begins on the first day of December. And when we categorize temperatures and other weather events and talk about the winter months, we're talking about December, January, and February. That's meteorological winter. So we are in that right now. And as you can see, our average high temperatures in the triangle will continue to go down through January, but then February and March, our average high temperatures in the triangle will start to go up. So that's a look back at where we've been and a look ahead to what's coming our way for the 12th month of the year. I'm in the studio, Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein for CBS 17. Guys, back to you.
Certainly good information there on what we saw in November and what we can expect through December as well, which we're sitting here at December 4th as of recording this. So the information very pertinent as to what we're going to see. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about something that we're all experiencing and have already experienced. That, of course, is the good old classic wedge. It's a curse word around here, right?
We love the wedge. Do we?
I don't know.
Should we use the actual cold air damming? That could be a curse word as well.
Cold air damming,
wedge.
yeah, whatever you want to call it. It's all just cursing.
Yep.
But we'll be right back, and we'll be talking about that.
On the radar with the CBS 17 Storm Team.
And welcome back to On the Radar. Meteorologist Rachel Dunsing here with meteorologist Ross Whitley. And we mentioned it before we went to break, kind of a curse word in North Carolina and really in a lot of parts of the Mid-Atlantic, especially in the Southeast.
Or elementary schoolers, wedgie.
Wow. I thought you were going to go the cold air damming route.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah. But that we're talking about. Yeah.
The wedge.
The wedge.
Cold air damming is the technical term. Cold air gets dammed up against the mountains, or the wedge sits on top of us, and we get cold, Ross.
Yes, we get cold. And if you are a winter weather fan, you really want to see this setup,
Right.
which is the one where we've got high pressure in control across the northeast. We get a coastal low to develop. We do not have a low pressure system that's kind of phased together with that off to the west, which we will talk more about in just a few seconds. Or if you think back to the first graphic of this show where we talked about the two storm tracks, the polar jet and the southern jet, if you do not have phasing going on, then you could potentially just get a coastal low. And these are these classic winter weather setups for us where we get a big snowstorm when the low stays off the coast and goes out to sea or goes up to the northeast, especially if that high pressure is locked in. And there's fancy terms that all come along with that. We typically call it blocking,
Yep.
where low pressure is going up the coast instead of out to sea. And that just keeps the cold air in place. It locks it in. We get that nice wedge. We have the column nice and cold, so we see snow. These are our classic snowstorms. However, there are a lot of other setups that this curse word brings us
Yep.
and other wedge setups. And the most tricky is probably this one.
Yeah, so this is the one where the low isn't quite off of the coast. So this is always the big problem when it comes to winter weather in North Carolina, particularly in central North Carolina, is the cold air already has to be in place. But we also have to have the low pressure in the proper location, because you don't just get snow wrapping it around an entire low pressure. It's normally shifted on the northwestern side, because that is normally the cold side of the low and where the colder air is typically set up. So if we get this sort of situation here where the low isn't off of the coast and it's kind of just moving right up through, we'll call it I-95. It's kind of an I-95 system, honestly. If it moves right up I-95, this is where we talk a lot about the rain-snow line issues. If it wobbles, and it's the same thing with tropical weather. You know, we always talk about tropical weather. A wobble one way or the other makes a big difference in terms of impacts. It is the same thing with winter weather. If that low pressure moves a dozen miles to the east, more of us are going to be dealing with snow or a wintry mix or some sort of wintry precipitation. If it moves a little bit farther to the west, more of us are going to be in the warm section of this system, and that means more of rain, maybe a bit of mix, but more rain than anything else. So the track really does make a difference, and that's why it can be really frustrating to forecast winter weather, especially in North Carolina, because everyone wants to know, are we going to get a foot of snow? Everyone wants to know, are we going to get an inch of snow? Sometimes we end up just getting stuck with a cold rain because that low just, I'm going to decide to wobble this way or wobble that way, and it totally changes the forecast and the impacts. So yeah, this is the one that we're normally stuck with. Cold air for a lot of us, but not all of us, and not everyone has the same thing.
Yeah, minor fluctuations in temperatures create a big drastic difference in forecast and forecast potential.
Chaos theory, if you will.
Yeah, and that
Let's not
not
go
only
down that
applies to
rabbit
the
hole.
track of the low, but it also applies to the column, which we'll
Yeah.
discuss here in a second as well. And there is a third type of situation where we get the wedge, and this is typically the most miserable. It is when we have the wedge in place, we have a retreating high pressure system. So in this case, that high that is off to our north is actually moving to the east with the low. And instead of a low going up the coast, we have the low off to our west. So cold air is in place initially. We might start off with ice, which is just freezing rain, maybe even sleet if there's enough of a cold air event going on. And then it transitions to all rain. As that low moves along that storm path there where the arrow is, we see the warm air dragged north. And when that happens, it just goes all to all rain. So we get all three of these setups. It happens quite frequently in the winter. And so a lot of times when we just have a cold, miserable rain, it's this. It's a low off to our west. In fact, we just had this.
Yep.
Not that long ago. So we had basically a low to our south and a low to our west. We had the cold air in place, but thanks to that low to the west, it wasn't enough cold air, and we warmed up through the event. So we went from the 30s in the mornings into the 40s in the afternoon as that warm air was driven in, and then a strong cold front brought us right back to the colder air. So this isn't the only tricky part of forecasting in the winter here in the Carolinas. There's also, unfortunately, this.
Yep. Remember, The atmosphere is not just what we're feeling here at the surface. It is three-dimensional. You got to go miles up to really get a full understanding of how we can get different kinds of precipitation, especially winter precipitation. So right now, this is kind of an easy scenario. If it is cold at the surface and it's cold all the way up in the upper levels of the atmosphere, anything that falls out of the sky in terms of precipitation, it's going to be snow because it's below freezing the entire way. But this is when things start to get a little more interesting. So normally at the top of the atmosphere, things are cold because it's just colder way up there. But if you get enough warm air, anything that started as snow, well, it's going to melt when it goes through the warm air on the way down. But right at the surface, you have just this tiny shallow layer of below freezing temperatures. And that is where we get freezing rain or an ice storm, because that rain is going to hit the surface that is below freezing, and it's basically going to freeze on contact. It is quite literally rain that is freezing when it hits surfaces. This is a pain in the rear.
Yes.
I mean, not just to deal with, but to forecast. And obviously all of us having to deal with ice on tree limbs, ice on power lines, all of that. I don't think it's a hot take to say that while freezing rain is an incredibly fascinating thing and interesting thing to forecast, it is the worst of all of the winter weather.
Yeah, and this is where
scenarios.
that wedge is so important, because depending on where the wedge is, how cold that is, and how shallow the layer of cold air is really the difference whether between we see snow, sleet, or freezing rain, just depending on how thick the warm layer is and how cold it is actually at the surface. I think the coldest I've ever seen freezing rain, not here in North Carolina, but actually like Portland, Oregon, I think it was like 14 degrees at the surface with freezing rain, which means that layer of cold air was very dense and it was very shallow. It was right at the surface and very, very cold. And then above, it was very, very warm, which kind of makes sense. You think about the Pacific Coast.
Northwest,
Lots of warm air coming in and cold air trapped down. And we get the same situation here as we just discussed with that wedge. But you can see why forecasting winter weather can be such a pain, especially when you have shallow layers of cold air, which happens quite frequently here. So that makes all of these things quite difficult, because 33 is just a plain old cold rain.
That's just a miserable day.
32.1, also just a miserable day.
32 or 31.9.
31.9, and it
might
is
get a little slick.
yeah, and it is more than miserable. It is actually bad.
Yeah.
And there are consequences when we have freezing rain, but it actually takes a little more ice than you might think. Typically, when we have winter weather events, especially ice events, we usually see maybe a 1/10 of an inch or a glaze, which is just a little bit of ice on things. And we get those quite frequently. That happens about once a winter, believe it or not. Across North Carolina, at least once a winter, there is some type of freezing event where we either have freezing fog or we've got like light freezing rain around and you get a little bit of ice. When it becomes an issue is when you start to accumulate a 1/4 of an inch of ice. That's 0.25. And if you're measuring that, it's just from the center of the ice out one way. It's not both ways, because most people will measure on a tree limb. And when you do that, 1/4 of an inch is going to measure as 1/2 an inch, because it's accumulating on both sides. It's only one direction. Yeah. So that's when things start to become an issue. When it gets to 1/2 an inch, we got bigger issues.
I mean, this is when you really have, at this point, like 0.25, that's a fairly significant ice storm. But anything more than that is way more significant. I mean, this is when you start to have tree limbs coming down. This is when you start to have power lines coming down. And as a result, that creates a pretty good likelihood for power outages. And of course, driving is going to be dangerous anytime there's a little bit of ice around, but especially when you have this much ice on surfaces. I mean, driving is just downright dangerous, and you should not be out on the roads at this point.
No, you shouldn't. And this type of event happens about every 3 to 7 years. So probably a little more frequently than you would think. And this is typically our bigger winter weather events when they do happen. It doesn't happen all that often, but 3 to 7 year return period is relatively frequently. And what happens only about once every 20 or 30 years, that's events greater than 1/2 an inch. And we've had several here in North Carolina where we have this wedge set up and we get warm, moist air to rise over the top of that, and we get a lot of ice. It does happen. When we get more than half an inch, that's when trees are falling. That's when travel is basically impossible. And this is where we're talking about widespread power outages. And if you go back to this date in 2002, we had exactly that. We had more than a half an inch. In fact, we had 1 inch of ice. I grew up in North Carolina. I remember this event. I'm embarrassed to say I was in middle school. So yeah, still a youngin'. But I was out of school for a week. They used the school as a shelter.
Wow.
So they were having people that did not have power to stay there and sleep in the school gymnasium. So even after all the ice melted, which was about a week later, they were still having to use the school as a shelter because there were just so many trees down, so many power lines down that people just didn't have power. So
I mean, an inch of ice is hard to think about.
it's a lot.
That's a lot of ice. I mean, we know what an inch of snow can do in North Carolina, let alone an inch of ice.
Yeah, I remember walking out the door in the morning with my dad and just hearing pine trees snapping.
Oh my gosh.
Just popping everywhere as we were walking around the neighborhood, which was crazy. So yeah, that was a crazy event. I also remember the 2003 event because that was the
1 year later.
following year. Yeah, that was crazy too because it's actually that event started as snow and then it switched
Technically
over
only
to
a couple
freezing
months
rain.
later, I guess. If that was December of 2002 and February of 2003, that was
Yeah.
just a few months later.
Yes, it's the same year. Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, that was one heck
What
of
a
a winter.
winter.
It was. It was the same year. We were out once again for a week. So that school year.
How late did you go into the summer?
Yes, we actually had school in the summer, like
Wow.
past the end of the year. They were adding like minutes onto every day because the
Oh my
teachers
gosh.
didn't want to do like 2 weeks longer than school was expected to
blame
end. So we were like staying like 10 minutes long every day for
Wow.
like a month.
Oh my gosh.
So that was crazy. But
Yikes.
as weird as those events were, how about January 1968, 5 days of freezing rain? When I pulled that up, now anything before, say, the 70s,
Yeah.
is really not all that well documented.
Mm-hmm.
So getting totals is kind of out the window because people aren't really going out there and measuring things. It's not
As
like
we do
today,
now,
as-
yeah. Yeah.
You get photo evidence of everything now. And back then you had photo evidence, but people just weren't that into documenting the weather. So if it didn't happen at a National Weather Service office, there's not really a great record of it.
Right.
So back in the 60s, 5 days of freezing rain. And then 1978, 10 years later. So think about the frequency of what we were saying, about every 20 to 30 years. So you can kind of map that out
Yeah.
here. It kind of applies. About 2 storms in 1 week of freezing rain. So yeah, that sounds miserable too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And then January 2023 or 2016, that was actually relatively recently. So
Yeah.
I was in I was in Kentucky when this happened. So I was already having my first job. So
Yeah.
I was not in North Carolina at that point in time. But so you probably remember the 2016 event. And speaking of that December 4th and 5th, 2002 event, it's described as Fran with ice.
Wow. Well, I mean, a big point of Fran was, what was it? That was the one that brought down all the trees and it just smelled like pine trees everywhere because Fran knocked down all the trees. So yeah, it would be very similar to that. I mean, again, look at that swath of up to an inch of ice. I mean, that is from Western Wake County all the way out through Greensboro and Charlotte. Like that's a pretty significant area to have that much ice. And also think about what goes through there. I-40, you have I-85 that all goes through there. Like a major travel corridor has been impacted by significant ice. And even though there's just a little less ice on I-95, you know that I-95, which is pretty bad on a normal day going up and down the East Coast, was probably significantly impacted by this event as well.
So hopefully we don't see anything like that this winter, fingers crossed, but we are onto a cold pattern already in December, so we'll see how things play out. But that is going to wrap it up for this week's edition of On the Radar, so thanks for joining us. We will be back next week with some more exciting adventures, probably of winter weather. I don't know.
Probably.
Maybe we'll do something else that's fun, or maybe we'll have to deal with a little winter weather between now and then. We'll see.
Maybe. Anything is possible.
And thank you, Kevin Durant. No, it's not Kevin Durant. It was Kevin Garnett, right?
Sure.
Celtics player.
Sure.
Okay.
I don't follow the NBA.
Yeah, there you go. All right.